of the goals of Metaviews is to bring together people with different perspectives, so that we can have the types of cross-pollinating discussions of how this interweb thing is affecting our world and our lives. Now, the format for today's event was meant to be a kind of briefing where each of the Metaviews researchers will give a very short 3 to 5 minute presentation on the work that they've been doing as part of our project over the last 6 months, which obviously ties into their broader work individually that they're doing as part of their professional or academic careers. And the idea is that we'd have a discussion extending from that subject material. So they're not supposed to be formal presentations. They're really meant to be short. We've asked Sharita to go first to talk about how our notion of authority is changing, followed by Luke, who's going to talk a little bit about 4chan, Anonymous, LulzSec, and some of the ways in which the authority is being challenged by some of the new models of organizing authority. Followed then by Dan, who's going to talk a little bit about video games and gaming culture and gamification. And then finally Ken, who's going to talk a bit about Bitcoins and alternative currency. And the idea was to then open it up as a discussion. Originally, we were going to break it up into small groups, but I think we have a small enough group that we can keep it as a circle. There were a number of people who had wanted to come, who couldn't come at the very last moment. And this is really meant to be the first in a series of events where, in addition to our weekly virtual seminars, we bring people into the flesh and get to know each other, see each other, and really learn more from our different perspectives and professional backgrounds. So with that said, I'm going to pass the mic over to Sharita, who's going to start us off around some of the work that she's doing in terms of how authority and trust are both changing.
Another form of authority, and actually the one that I'm particularly interested in, is when you have authority and you look at it as a person with expertise or specialized knowledge that you really need or you would like to know more about. So that would be an authority, not in terms of power, perhaps, although that's quite contested. It can be in terms of power, but not necessarily in terms of power or coercion. With somebody with expertise, you approach them. It's more your choice to come into their sphere of authority and try to learn something. So in some ways, it can be looked at quite differently than when you're looking at the authority of government, or the authority of the police, or the authority that happens in schools, or even differently than, let's say, somebody in authority, like I sometimes am, in a university classroom. Because I'm supposed to be the prof, therefore I'm the authority. And one of the things that I really try to break down very quickly with my students is that in essence, yes, I have authority. I have authority in this room. I won't let anything bad happen to you. I'm making this a safe environment. But in terms of real learning, that I'm probably going to learn just as much as you are. So let's drop this, hello, professor. And I really try to keep that up all the way through. So when you look at authority, one of the things where in some ways it's very, very similar to trust is that authority is contextual. It evolves, okay, over time. It waxes, it wanes. And it can be tacit or hidden, okay? Look around this room. Who has authority in this room? Jesse.
You have the mic.
And I have the mic right now. And I have the mic right now. Okay, but it would be totally different in another context, in another environment. It's a very contested definition. As a matter of fact, it has been, for instance, an example, the authority of the Pope, the infallibility of the Pope, has been contested ever since the 1st century AD, when they decided to have somebody go up there and be the bishop of all bishops, the head of the church. It also evolves over time. For instance, in England, there was the divine right of kings. that the barons challenged in terms of King John with the Magna Carta. Now, they challenged him because he was trying to take away their money, right? And that really forced them to go against him. And then really the divine right of kings went away almost completely at the time of the English Civil War. And, so that went away. So we're constantly changing. And tacit authority, who was really the authority in Louis XIII's court? Him or Cardinal Richelieu? In terms of George W. Bush, who was really the authority? He or Cheney? Okay? It's open to a lot of discussion depending on where you sit, in terms of ideology and politics. So the kind of authority that I'm really interested in is called cognitive authority. And that's the authority where people are deemed experts and they have specialized knowledge and they share that knowledge. Now, that's been around since the beginning of time. I mean, you have, the shamans, you have the wise men, you have the crones, which I'm trying to gracefully grow into. So you have people with a great deal of knowledge. But what happens when you hit the online environment, as we have been doing for the past 15 or 20 years? And what happens in that environment? It's arguably the largest platform of authority in terms of that kind of authority. But who becomes the authority? How do people become the authority? How do people assess somebody in authority? I quickly spoke to somebody this morning and I just, quickly said to them, when you hear the word authority, what do you think of? And the person answered back, bad, don't like it. And I said, okay, but what about the authority of an expert? And they said, yeah, now that's easier for me to accept. Except, how do I trust them? How do I know they're a real authority? Trudy, you're an authority. You've got a PhD. Okay, I've got a credential. But does that make me an authority everywhere, in everything, or just in a very, very small piece? So the kinds of things that I do research in is really looking at issues of credibility, trust, expertise, how we assess them, what criteria we use, and how it can be built over time. And I look at it in online groups, in terms of online teaching, and in terms of workplace learning and change.
At last count, 4chan had about, what Google's reporting on, it's 18 million unique visitors a month, which makes it the largest English-speaking internet forum outside of social media sites. So that's pretty substantial. It's huge. Exactly. It also generates a similar level of activity to YouTube. So in terms of user activity and user contributions and stuff like that, it's up there. And that's a feat that's been accomplished without any venture capital, any marketing or promotion budgets, ever making a profit. It's entirely a kind of grassroots thing. And so, especially as well, the rise of the individual who started 4chan, this kid Christopher Poole, who we often know as Moot, who's sort of increasingly becoming a little more high profile in terms of the venture capital scene in New York, and he's got a new venture called Canvas, which is still up in the air whether or not he's going to be able to sort of create a monetizable version of 4chan or not. But his rise, and as well as the size of the community that he's been able to amass, I think is a bit of a kind of a storming the gates of the traditional authorities in social media and Web 2.0. If you read some of the popular press about Moot, he's often kind of portrayed as the anti-Zuckerberg, I guess, in a lot of ways. And the fact that, he's been so successful at creating this community, and the fact that, 18 million people every month express a desire to participate online in a place where their activities aren't connected to their real life, is really profound. And it goes against sort of the dominant rhetoric of the end of privacy. And, Zuckerberg himself has said that if you have two identities, it's just a lack of integrity, et cetera. And so there's certainly a critical mass of people who would definitely disagree with that. I think that's challenging the rhetoric of authority that's emerging in that sphere. Now there's also Anonymous, who emerged out of 4chan in 2006 and spent a few years kind of, doing a lot of juvenile pranks and kind of just disruptions and stuff online, raiding other websites, saying things they're not supposed to say and stuff. But recently they've really transitioned away from that sort of pranking aspect to become a fairly viable and effective political force both online and in real life. They've just sort of a recap of stuff that they've done. In 2008, they made headlines for protesting the Church of Scientology. You may remember the kids in Guy Fawkes masks outside Scientology centers all over the world. That was 2008. In 2009, they sort of helped with some of the stuff that happened around the Iranian election protests. In 2010, they launched organized denial of service campaigns against the music industry as well as the opponents of WikiLeaks. And in 2011, they played a significant role in the online aspect of the Arab Spring. So they're out there, they're doing stuff. And what they've done is they've taken this radical anonymity that is present on 4chan and tried to turn it into some kind of workable ethic for organizing and being an activist. They take their status as kind of a leaderless, mercurial group very seriously. And so anyone at all can take up the banner of Anonymous and do something. They don't police its usage. And in particular, what I find really interesting in my own work is that anyone within Anonymous who begins to accrue any authority, to accrue any individual social capital, reputation, and all this kind of stuff, or anyone who acts like a leader, it gets chastised. They get sort of taken to task by the rest of the community. And we saw this not that long ago. Just last month, Anonymous kind of descended into a brief period of civil war as some of the people who were behind AnonOps, a website, one of the more high-profile nodes in the Anonymous network, sort of came under attack from the rest of the community for acting too much like leaders. And so this kind of really staunch anti-ego ethic that's present in the community has led to this real interesting intragroup dynamic where authority is pooling and dispersing in ways that we're really only beginning to understand now. And so that's something that I'm looking at right now in my own research and stuff, and something that I'd love to talk about and hear from you about as well. And lastly, I want to talk about LulzSec, Lulz Security. Hopefully, if you've been paying attention to the news at all, you've seen them. They've kind of been everywhere lately, and they're the ones who were sort of hacking Sony, and they've gone and they're pretty much a hack-a-day program. They're doing something pretty much every day. And while they're not nearly as anonymous as Anonymous or 4chan, they've obviously got an identity. They're LulzSec, they have a Twitter account, it's centralized, all this kind of stuff. I think they're kind of disrupting authority in a bit of a different way. They're an example of what Dana Boyd, a researcher out of the Microsoft Research Institute, she talks about hacking the attention economy. And I think LulzSec is a really good example of this. Not only are they, sort of messing with authority in a fairly traditional sense in that they're making Sony and other big players look kind of foolish, they're also doing so in a way that is generating a real significant amount of media attention for them. Right? They're sort of their sense of humor, the spectacle that they attach to some of the things that they do, the sort of like just the way that they use social media in terms of Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and all these kinds of things have garnered them a lot of sort of followers. In a month they've picked up half or a quarter of a million Twitter followers, and there's a story about them in the news every day, right? So if you're willing to concede a little bit that LulzSec's goal as gray hat hackers, which again I think any one of us could explain to you if you're not familiar with the term. If you can see that their goal isn't necessarily just to hack Sony, right? It's not about successful hacking per se. It's about reminding sort of the masses that have lapped up on the shores of the internet over the last 10 years that maybe they should be a little more careful with their personal information, right? Piercing through the rhetoric of Amazon and eBay and all these people who want you to feel very comfortable spending money online and sort of showing the realities of it, about how it isn't very secure and all that kind of stuff. And that's generally the gray hat mission. And if that's what LulzSec is up to, they've done an absolutely fantastic job. And they've done so without any real technical skill. The hacks that they're doing are fairly basic stuff. I'm not a hacker, I don't have the knowledge to do what they do, but the security community is kind of pouncing on them and being like, oh, these are just a bunch of kids with like computer science 101 and they're doing all this kind of stuff, but that doesn't really matter. And that's an interesting play on authority online because it's not so much about technical skill, which was what it was about for a long time, and more about how to have a knowledge of the lulz and the attention economy. And so these kids, they're really young, like they just arrested one of them, he's 19. They're the most successful gray hat hackers of the last decade. And they did so without any real profound technical skill. And that's certainly interesting. And just I want to close a bit by reminding everyone that we're sort of talking about the future of authority as well. We're not just talking about authority in the present. And I think that becomes really acute when you consider the average age of the people that are involved in all these communities, right? I just mentioned the 19-year-old kid from Lulsec, but the average age on 4chan, and I'm sure Lee can attest to this, is probably about 18 years old. The people from Anonymous were really well represented in the youth that were packing Tahrir Square in Cairo. It's young people. And, as someone who's fairly young myself, you can disagree with me, I guess, if you want, but I think we've lived through an era where young people have watched authority embodied oftentimes by political influence, but mostly just by money and capital, kind of undermine democracy through lobbying, through marketing, through campaign financing, and all this kind of stuff. And what we're seeing, I think, in 4chan and Anonymous and Lulsec and all these related groups is a recognition by young people that authority, in the traditional sense, is a barrier to democracy now. And I think that's what Paul Mason, who's a columnist for the BBC, he wrote this awesome article called 20 Reasons Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere about the Arab Spring. I suggest you go take a look at it. But in it, he mentions that what he sees is that youth have a much better understanding of power nowadays. And this is that the first kind of power that Sharita was talking about. And that the youth don't necessarily see things along the lines of class or economics and all this kind of stuff, but rather just about power. Who has authority? Who sets the agenda? And they become really good at screwing with the people that have that authority, right? And so Anonymous, Lulsec, 4chan, all of these things are becoming these sort of, I want to call them mimetic gateways, almost for people that have a desire to experiment with disrupting hierarchy and disrupting authority. And we should definitely expect to see a lot more of them. That's actually an Anonymous slogan, expect us, and I think that's fairly accurate for what we should expect to see as we move forward. And lastly, just to go full circle with authority, what's great about all of these things is they're these really decentralized forms, but they're great at getting stuff done, right? They're in the news, they're achieving things, they're accomplishing stuff. And if you're familiar at all with the history of the internet, the history of hackers and programmers and open source developers and all this kind of stuff, getting things done is the surest and most direct route.
We're talking about the future of authority, and it seems to be that kind of the theme is that power hasn't really gone anywhere. We have all these leveling technologies and things like that that make it seem like, for the most part, that things are changing. Power isn't really disappearing; it's just doing new things. And I think another important thing for me is that power still has dreams. There's still people out there dreaming about the kind of power that they want, but maybe the power of the past, the power of the future. But anyway, so and I say this in context is essentially, if you guys are familiar with gamification at all, I think gamification right now kind of embodies the dreams of what people want for power, how they want to utilize power, and things like that. So just a quick summary of gamification. It's essentially just using game-like things, so specifically video game-like mechanics, to and apply them to things that technically aren't really games. So you're talking about going to the mall or going to your pub or something like that through the platform Foursquare, which uses GPS locations to find out where you are and check you in and give you badges and all this kind of stuff. Or the Huffington Post game, which you get badges and achievements for reading and commenting and all those kind of weird things like that. And then there's also the kind of gamification in your everyday life. So things like you use games called Chore Wars, where you compete with your spouse or your kids to do chores in the house. The idea is if you get a badge or points, then you kind of gain this excess social good by having a mechanic there that gets you to want to do something that you might not necessarily find to be very fun typically. So in essence, that's what gamification is. And then if any of you are familiar with the professor Jane McGonigal, she's kind of contributed heavily to the rhetoric around what gamification is, although they call it gamification. She kind of talks about games in general, but she wants to use games to kind of achieve excess social good. So if you've seen her TED Talk, she says, this is how many people play video games right now. Actually what we need is this many million more people playing video games all the time, and then we'll solve global warming. We will solve the oil crisis. We will solve all these kinds of things. So she's contributed a lot of rhetoric, a lot of the kind of dreams to what we can do with games and these kind of mechanical type setups. And she kind of specifically talks about what game designers actually calls them happiness engineers. So these are people who engineer happiness, which kind of reminds me of what Herbert Hoover said when he came to office as President of the United States. He said to all the people who are PR people in the world, he said to them, you guys create happiness machines for people. So again, you kind of see a line between past and But again, so people are to be engineered, they can be made happy, and then they can do things that are good. And so the other kind of fun term to use for what gamification is Ian Borgas's calls it exploitationware. So he tends to talk a lot about farmville. He created a game called Cow Clicker, which is all about how people are being exploited for these things. But I think it's a provocative term, and I like to use it sometimes, not always. But I think it kind of cuts to the core of what some people might think gamification is. Right. So in essence, okay. So it's capturing the minds of people, and I think it's capturing the minds of people right now because in a lot of circles, advertising and marketing might feel kind of dated and might be running out of steam. We've all been raised on kind of, especially my generation, the young, like some other people here. We were raised on, like Saturday morning cartoons and early forms of the internet and like radio, television, all these things. But like especially very self-referential advertising. The Budweiser commercials, they kind of were big. So yeah. Here, what companies use the most self-referential, ironic humor possible to beer companies, right? So you have to create that to create bonds with brands and things like that. But we've all kind of been weaned on this, so we're all really media savvy, and I think that's important. Is that we all really, a lot of people now are really jaded about advertising and marketing, and things like that. So and it's kind of all predicated on this Freudian view of the world that we all just kind of want. Like things that satisfy our inner desires, things that we don't necessarily need these things, but we want them. So it's kind of cynical. But what does everyone do today when they see advertising and things like that? Well, first thing they say in most forums, first or after that, they normally say, okay, it's fake, it's staged, this is Photoshop. You all are familiar with that iconic photo from the Vancouver riots that happened. The man with the woman is kissing her. It looks very romantic and beautiful. And it was actually a rumor circulated pretty quickly on the internet that it was fake. It was staged. So, some savvy photographer out there says, aha, I have an idea for a really, iconic photograph. I'll get out some actors and then make them stage this thing. And of course, it ended up that wasn't true. But we always are so jaded that we think the first thing that actually is fake. We always want to deconstruct. The philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, he says that kind of, but we have one ideology or one particular view of the world today. It's that of deconstruction. We all want to break down everything immediately. That's kind of just what we believe in. We don't really believe in anything anymore. So I think kind of coming back to games is I think that in general we can think of games as being these kind of really powerful things, but they're also going to become very prosaic. They're going to fade into the background. Like all kind of previous technologies. So, television is a prosaic, we don't really care about it too much, it's just there. Radio, even less so, people care less, and then, telegraph, whatever happened to that, who cares about telephones. All these technologies are prosaic, but they're actually all very powerful. If there's anything that we think about when these kinds of technologies happen, we can look at some of the past things that were achieved with these technologies. The rise of fascism in the 1920s and the 1930s was mostly enabled by mass media, like radio, early forms of television, things like that. The genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s was actually made possible through radio transmissions. So technology, actually can be used for very powerful things and very bad things, and also can be used for good things. So I think that we need to keep in mind that technologies have a moral dimension, and so they can ethical, and that means that we need to kind of return to what our ethics are, right? So what do we think are ethical uses of technology? And again, so coming back to education. So I think what marketers and advertisers and all these kinds of things, people want to return to that kind of power that people once had with technology, and it kind of offers that way in because everyone who spins about gamification, they say, look at all these clever hacks, kind of mind hacks of the trick, kind of Pavlovian dog kind of Skinner boxes, right? Press the button, get the reward kind of thing. So that seems to kind of regenerate this idea of having power. One person can have power at the top, the guy who creates the game, and then everyone at the bottom will scurry and try and achieve that just because they're being hacked. So I guess it's just that we need to keep in mind that power and control are changing fundamentally, and I think that it's not so much that games can be used exclusively for these kinds of unethical ways, especially amplification and exploitation ways. Is that like they have the possibilities for it good and bad, and we need to keep in mind that we have morality to deal with when it comes to exploitation or things like that. And games are going to fade into the background. We're not going to really care about them so much in 10 years. It's not going to be this panacea for marketing and PR. It's actually going to be something that's really just every day. We're going to be dealing with games all the time in all sorts of forms and situations. And in essence, is that they're going to be used from the bottom, so people are going to challenge authority. People already make games that are trying to challenge the status quo, what is happening, critique things. But it's also people at the top who are going to be trying to bring their ideas down and influence people. And I think it's just that, like, in essence, just to keep in mind that, right now it's people think that they're going to solve the problems. They're going to get power back to the top. But it's actually going to be much more complicated. It's not just a solution, it's also not.
It's a deflationary currency. There's a finite number of bitcoins that will be created. It's something that's 6 million and 6.5 million are created right now, being created. There's always 500 bitcoins every hour are created. And so by 2034, 2038, there'll be 21 million. So necessarily, because it's got a finite number of coins, it's a deflationary currency. Now this makes economists freak out. It's the only time that all of our inflationary currencies, which are used by all of the Western world and by most of the rest of the world, in fact, are all inflationary. To some degree, it's been extremely bad. Think of Mexico, think of Argentina, think of the problems Greece is having even now. And because of the bailouts in the states and how they're solving, which is quantitative easing too, which is very complicated. I don't understand it except when someone explained it to me as what it is, which is printing money. This is devaluing the savings that people in the states have in a very bad time, and they should be insanely outraged at the government, but they've made it so complicated that they're not. And I think Bitcoin, as Luke has been saying, is kind of a response to the way that the establishment, as it were, has manipulated banking laws and currency just on fiat to maintain the geopolitical positions that they've invested so heavily in. And I see Bitcoin as a response to that. And what I've been reading actually, where Bitcoin stands to have the most success is in those places where the banking systems are very corrupt or very slow or broken. This is the third world, which is where there's a lot of business actually starting now, especially in raw resources, which all, of course, are now completely convertible to food. Every resource is convertible to food. So Africa is going to be a huge place. Their banking system is completely broken. Most of the time, you put a truck full of money and you put it down the road, and you send it down the road with a bunch of guys with guns. And I was just reading someone's blog who's been doing economics research in Africa, saying this is where Bitcoin is really going to thrive. No longer do you have to risk, your 6 guys with Uzis not being enough for your $5 million in the truck. You can actually just send it with Bitcoins. And you can look, Bitcoins are not anonymous. They're pseudonymous. Everybody you can create as many addresses as you want, but once you use that address to spend or send a Bitcoin from one person to another, everybody can see it necessarily because the calculation has to be done to legitimize that transaction. So you don't see it when you receive or anybody else receives a Bitcoin, you only see it when they're spent. Now there are some ways to make it more complicated, but for the most part people haven't been adopting those methods. It will come. There'll be services that will educate people, that will do it for you. And right now, because generating a Bitcoin by mining it, as it's called on your computer, is too hard and too slow to do just by yourself. You might see one payout, and my average would be every 4 or 5 months right now at the current rate. I'll get my 50 Bitcoins. Instead, I contribute to a pool. But we have to trust the management of the pool and who's operating it. And in the pool that I was in, the guy made a change because he had a problem with his programming about 2 weeks ago. And we saw it's basically a change in banking policy. And this pool is the equivalent of a bank. And he just made a fiat change, and the customers, as it were, freaked out. Some of them left the pool, kind of like a run on a bank. So we're seeing the formation of this community-based level. There's no act of law that puts him in charge of the pool. He just runs the service, and his constituent members give him feedback. And contrary to the rest of what I see usually in IRC, Internet Relay Chat, which is where a lot of anonymous and 4chan type people hang out, is that people are incredibly ready to listen to each other and take suggestions because we realize we've all got some sort of stake in this, and to make it work, we have to cooperate and fix this, make this system work.